Hi guys, my name is Stephanie and I am back with another video. Today we're going to be testing 5 different ways to clean dried out paintbrushes. So we're going to get that dried out paint off of your paintbrushes and save them for another job. To set up this test, I have grabbed 5 of my old paintbrushes, dipped them in paint, got all that paint into the bristles really good, and then let that dry out overnight. These options are only going to be for acrylic and latex paints. If you are using an oil-based paint, check the can. It'll tell you what you need to do to get dried out paint off of the brushes for those paints. It's either going to be something like mineral spirits or turpentine. So check the can. It'll tell you what you need to do. Latex and acrylic paints are a little bit harder. We're going to test a bunch of different options that I found on Reddit that people were swearing by and see if they actually work. So like I already said, I let that paint dry out overnight. The next day, so about 15 hours later, I was ready to set up my test. The first option that I decided to try was regular rubbing alcohol from the store. So this is just the kind of rubbing alcohol that you can get at the pharmacy section of your grocery store. Typically, you would use something like denatured alcohol from the hardware store to try to remove paint. But the can is really big. It's about $20. I don't have much use for it, so I decided I wanted to find out if the pharmacy version would work just as well. The next option I decided to test was Murphy's oil soap. So I saw this recommended a few times. I always have some on hand. So again, I dipped a paintbrush into the Murphy's oil soap. Try to keep whatever you're testing, whatever you're using to remove the paint, try to keep that below the metal band. So the metal band will have some sort of adhesive in it that's holding the bristles in place. You don't want to start to dissolve that adhesive. Nowadays, it's a super strong adhesive. It's harder to dissolve it than it was years ago, but still, try to avoid getting it up to the metal band. For the third test, I am using Citristrip. It is my favorite paint remover for furniture. So let's see how it does on a paintbrush. I just popped some of that in a baggie and then put the paintbrush in it, made sure that I got the paint bristles covered in that paint remover as much as possible. Test number 4 I saw recommended online a bunch of times, and that is dish soap and super hot water. So I boiled a pot of hot water like I would for drinking a cup of tea and use that. So supposedly this is supposed to loosen up hardened paint on your paintbrush. We'll see how it works. I will say that within a minute of putting it into that hot water, it did seem to be loosening up some paint already. I could wipe some of it off onto a brush, and before it was super stiff and I couldn't even move the bristles around. And the last test is going to be hot vinegar. So I actually microwaved this for about 2.5 minutes to get that vinegar really hot. This is just normal kitchen vinegar, again, that you can get at the grocery store. I will say that this is our worst paintbrush. My husband uses it to paint our fence outside, so it's really roughed up. It's covered in like bits of black paint already before I started this test. So this one's got a hard job ahead of it. I let all 5 of these paintbrushes soak in whatever cleaning solution I was trying to use for 2 hours. And about every half an hour, I would come back and move the bristles around, or the brushes around like you see me doing right now with that black paintbrush. I was hoping that moving the paintbrushes around would work that cleaner into the bristles a lot more, help loosen up the paint a lot more as it was sitting in the solution. Okay, now that you've seen the setup, let's fast forward in time 2 hours and see how it turned out. I'm using a paintbrush comb and scraper to do this, but you could also just use a really cheap hair comb. This is the brush that I had soaking in alcohol for 2 hours, and I didn't actually have very high hopes for this one. I knew that denatured alcohol from the hardware store was recommended to remove paint from latex and acrylic paint from paintbrushes. But this cheap pharmacy rubbing alcohol worked really well, surprisingly well on this latex paint. I was able to scrape off all of that hardened paint in the brush after about just a minute and a half of work. It wasn't very hard at all, didn't take much effort. It just needs to be rinsed out now and I can start using it again. Okay, let's move on to the Murphy's oil soap option. This one feels a lot softer and like a lot of the paint has been loosened or removed already. So again, I'm just scraping it with that paintbrush. So this one took only about a minute and a half of scraping and brushing too, and I was able to get all of the paint out of that brush. Now with this one, you will have a lot of oil residue left behind in the bristles, so you have to be sure to rinse it really well, get all of that oil out before you use the brush again for paint. Next up is the brush that I had soaking in the hot vinegar. And I have to say that vinegar didn't seem to do much of anything to loosen the paint in this paintbrush. Again, this is our worst paintbrush. It was the most difficult one, but the vinegar did nothing for me. So I decided to set that brush aside and test it in either the Murphy's oil soap or alcohol. Next up is that brush that I had soaking in dish soap and hot water. And again, this didn't seem to work as quickly or as easily as the Murphy's Oil soap or the rubbing alcohol. I was kind of surprised because a lot of people did recommend this. But I think when they're recommending it for paintbrushes that haven't dried out completely. So maybe a paintbrush that you left sitting for 20 minutes and then you come back to it. This brush sat, like I said, for 12-15 hours. So it was completely hardened and stiff, and the soapy water was doing nothing. So since the dish soap was a fail, I decided to pop that paintbrush into the Murphy's Oil soap and see how it worked in there. The last paintbrush that I needed to test was the one that I had soaking in the Citristrip. And like I said, I love Citristrip on furniture, but it was making a hot mess of this paintbrush. I have to say, Citristrip or removing paint with anything makes you have a gummy paint residue to scrape off. So using it to remove the paint on the paintbrush meant that I had gummy paint residue all inside of the bristles. It was peeling up and making tiny little bits of paint residue in the bristles. Those tiny bits were kind of hard to get out of the bristles, so that meant that if I was going to use that paintbrush again to paint anything, I was risking the possibility of having lots of little tiny bits in my fresh paint. So since the Citristrip wasn't coming out of that brush very well, I decided to soak that brush and the black brush that was still really stiff in rubbing alcohol. I left that Citristrip brush in the rubbing alcohol for about half an hour before I came back to see if it was working better. That rubbing alcohol was able to loosen all of that residue that was left behind from the Citristrip, so I was able to brush it out clean within about a minute, and then I took it into my laundry room and washed the 3 good paintbrushes out with just a little Dawn soap and hot water. By this time, I was losing the light outside, so I left the other 2 paintbrushes to soak overnight, so let's skip ahead in time. The next day, I had my gloves back on and some eye protection, and I got to work on those 2 paintbrushes. I will say that the alcohol was able to get the paint out of that really bad, roughed up black paintbrush. It just took a little bit of extra effort. And the Murphy's Oil soap did get all of the paint out of the other paintbrush. Once I had scraped and cleaned those 2 paintbrushes, I did the same thing. I rinsed them out. Then I took them inside for a quick wash with dish soap and hot water. And here's a look at the 5 paintbrushes now. So just as a quick recap, if you want to remove hardened paint from your paintbrushes, try rubbing alcohol from the pharmacy, Murphy's Oil soap. You could also get denatured alcohol from the hardware store. And Citristrip makes a brush cleaner. So I've never tried the Citristrip brush cleaner. A lot of people say that works really well too. So if you want to buy something from the hardware store, give that a go too. That's it for today's video, guys. Thanks for checking it out, and see you next time.